Today we'll be discussing comedian Pete Davidson, and we'll be discussing Crohn's disease. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic for medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing comedian and actor Pete Davidson. Now, Pete suffers from Crohn's disease, so in our second hour, we'll be discussing that disease. And of course, this is a little twosie, because you might remember a few episodes ago, we discussed Georges St. Pierre, the MMA fighter, and we discussed ulcerative colitis. And ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease are both a part of the umbrella term inflammatory bowel disease. So that's what we're going to be talking about.
And it's interesting that you called it a twosie today, because Pete Davidson does refer to Crohn's disease as the poopy disease, which in our house, sometimes we say somebody's got to go do a twosie. So it all really comes full circle. Also, it's good for us to discuss Crohn's disease to give some context to people who may not understand what it is, which I believe would be the majority of human beings, and don't reduce it simply to poopy disease.
Yeah, you know, when I was thinking about, people might know I did try to do a stand-up set a long time ago, like 15 years ago. I'll be seen it.
And you did a twosie in your pants on stage.
No, but I was like, oh, maybe I should go for like the childhood, schoolyard potty humor. I'd be like, what's up with number one and number two? Is like poop so much better that it gets like the higher number? Or is it we're number one for pee? And what if you do both at the same time? Is it a 1 + 2? It's a 3? Is that funny?
I mean, in your voice with your medical qualifications, yeah, it is. But a normal person saying that, I don't know.
Okay, Ellie, let's get started with Pete Davidson. Interesting guy, very popular amongst the kids today.
I mean, he's a kid himself, you could say, right?
Yeah.
He just turned 30 last year. I mean, we can share our opinions about our thoughts about his work and different things he's done, but it's definitely impressive what he's have been able to do in 1 decade of his career.
Yeah.
I don't imagine if we keep doing this podcast for another decade, I can't imagine this is the last time we talk about Pete Davidson.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, let's go through some of his background. So he is, I think people know he's from Staten Island, grew up there. And of course, when he was quite young, this was a seminal moment, obviously, in his life. It was 9/11. Of course, many of you probably know his father was a firefighter. He was on ladder 118. And he died during the September 11th attack. So what happened was his whole unit died. His father was last seen running up the stairs of the Marriott World Trade Center just before it was destroyed when they collapsed. And of course, you can imagine, I think he was around
He was 7 or 8, yeah.
At that time. And that is obviously traumatic. And he had obviously a tough time dealing with it. He's very honest about this. He's talked about this in interviews and his stand-up. It's not a secret. And we'll talk about how this informs his stand-up maybe towards the end of this section. But he, I guess, acted out at school almost to the point that he tore out all of his hair till he was bald. So we've talked about that before, like trichotillomania as a psychiatric symptom, but to the point where you're bald is pretty extreme. And there's a couple articles we're linked to. There's a good one from the New York Times. It's about a decade old. It was kind of when he was first coming up through SNL. It's a good read, though, because it kind of goes into his backstory a bit. And it's a quote from his mother. She said, "It was sad how sad he was growing up." And she talks about him ripping out his hair, and he became a lab rat, in quotation marks, for doctors studying the children of 9/11 victims. And she said it was overwhelming, and I'm sure it is. And he certainly talks about his mother in his most recent stand-up special. So really a difficult time for him. And of course, he kind of veered into stand-up comedy. And again, if you read these articles, his mother was like, this was an outlet for him. He seemed to enjoy it as a teenager. So of course I would drive him to the clubs, right? From Staten Island into the downtown New York clubs. And she'd just do anything for him, obviously, because she just wants her children to be happy after having such a traumatic event happen to them, because he has a sister as well.
It's interesting that you use those words, that his mother said that he enjoyed it. The first time I remember seeing Pete Davidson, my first thoughts were like, this guy doesn't look like he really wants to be here. And I think what that really was a guy who's sort of suffered some unspeakable tragedy in his life.
I think that's an interesting point. Again, I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth or assuming too much. There are many times that Pete Davidson has said he didn't want to be here, like on this earth. You know what I mean? So even if stand-up is maybe a beacon in his history of depression and suicidality, he still may come off as having this thing. So he's certainly had issues. I mean, he's talked about obviously depression, suicidality. He was actually diagnosed recently with borderline personality disorder. You can check our archives for our episode on BPD. So, he's had to certainly deal with a lot.
That was an interesting thing too, Asif, to add to BPD. His moods, quote unquote, he attributed to his regular marijuana usage and drug usage. He cut the drugs. He was down in a significant way with marijuana, only to realize it wasn't the marijuana. It was actually borderline personality disorder, right? That he was played from. Yeah. It's funny, in his latest special, he does say, I don't get a lot of wins. And if you don't know his history, you'd be like, hey, man, I'm watching you on a Netflix special in a filled out theater. It feels like you get wins, but to dig deep into his life, certainly hasn't been easy. I do know that when he was 20 years old on SNL, he was the youngest cast member, probably since Eddie Murphy. I was ready for the next Eddie Murphy, right? The next coming of Eddie Murphy. I didn't see that at all. The story behind him getting on SNL, he got a chance to audition for the show because of Bill Hader, which only would have increased my confidence in what he was going to be all about. He met Bill Hader when he had a small part on Trainwreck, at the Judd Apatow comedy with Amy Schumer and Bill Hader, in which Bill Hader does a phenomenal.
Yeah, and Pete Davidson is pretty good friends with Amy Schumer. I think they met during stand-up, and I think she also helped his career quite a bit. And that's why she gave him a small part in Trainwreck. And then, as you said, like through meeting Bill Hader, this kind of SNL came about.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember his part on Trainwreck, to be quite honest. But again, it is a small role. There's a bunch of small roles he's had over the years. SNL is the big one. And for the first chunk of it, quite frankly, I was like, where is the guy that all the hype is around? Where is what am I missing? But over his, I guess it was 7 or 8 seasons at SNL, he did prove himself to be quite popular, and recently was back as a guest host.
Yeah, exactly. And I think his main bits, I think there's 3 things that he does. Like, he'll be on Weekend Update as usually playing himself. He was like, I think the youth correspondent or something like that. That's more of a Daily Show joke, but it was something along the lines of that. And then he would do a lot of music videos. That would be the thing, often with a musical guest, rap videos, pretty funny. And then, of course, I think his most famous character is Chad, right? Chad is this apathetic young adult. I think he first appeared in the Julia Louis-Dreyfus episode where he becomes a pool boy entangled with a lonely woman. And the idea is like she's obsessed with this guy, this young man, and he is like Chad. And like, Ali, what's the Chad famous line?
Well, I'm going to impersonate Chad, but I'm also impersonating my 12-year-old son, unfortunately, at the exact same time. But it's a lot of like, huh? Okay. I don't know. All right. Chad, will you come in and make love to me? Like he's just, nothing excites this guy. And it's just a lot of shoulder shrugs and like, I don't know.
So,
all right.
So pretty funny stuff. And then I guess he left SNL. Obviously, he's had these issues with drug use and rehab and some issues there. But he's been in the show Bupkis on Peacock. Yeah, which is the NBC streaming service. Dan St. Germain talked about that when he was on our podcast a couple weeks ago. And then he was in The King of Staten Island. What do you think about this movie there, Ollie?
I think that's his best work. I think it also has to do with the type of comedy that I think I enjoy now more than ever, which is the personal stuff. And I think as he started to mine things that were personal, it gave way to funnier things in my mind, but it also helped audiences understand why he jokes the way he does, And I think King of Staten Island had a really personal element to it, and it really showed off his acting chops as well. and I liked everything around it, and I think when Judd Apatow does things like this, similar to The Big Sick with Kumail Nanjiani, and people tell their personal stories, I think Judd himself loves, confessional comedians. He loves stories that have heart and humor. And I think it was a great pairing, Apatow and Pete Davidson. And I thought, yeah, I would recommend The King of Staten Island. I think I delayed for a long time watching it. I was like, oh, I don't know if it's going to be good. And then my daughter was like, I think you'd like it. And she's usually right. I was a fan of that. It had all the discomfort and the comedy of what is Pete Davidson's own life.
Yeah, and so I think, in my opinion, this is what people see in Pete Davidson. So Judd Apatow, Bill Hader, Lorne Michaels, this is what they see in him, because there is so much, obviously, trauma and issues beneath his like jokey exterior. And I think he has the potential to become a really good dramatic actor. Like Adam Sandler does his comedies now mainly on Netflix, but he does dramatic roles, right? When he was in Punch Drunk Love, P.T. Anderson's Punch Drunk Love, like you're like, this guy's amazing. And you'll see that's what Sandler does. He'll do like several of his comedies, and then, every 4 years or so, he'll do a dramatic role. Remember Uncut Gems? He was like so good in Uncut Gems. I would hope that Pete Davidson would do that a bit more, combine the comedy and more dramatic stuff, because I think he is going to be able to do it. And I think maybe that's what people see in him. I don't know.
I hear you.
Speaking of what people see in him, hello.
Quite a wonderful dating life that this man has had.
So that's, I think, what he's known a lot for is the people he's dated. So it's been a lot.
If you're in your later 40s or 50s, he's probably dated somebody you know's daughter. That's what it feels like, right? Larry David, his daughter, Cassie David, who I've actually never heard of until I was researching. I know Larry David had a daughter, but is Cassie David out there acting?
No, I only heard about her when I heard that she was dating.
Yes. So some of these people getting their moments of fame, you don't get famous because of your father, who's Larry David, but you get famous because Pete Davidson. I mean, that's an interesting world we live in. I think Ariana Grande would have been the first major, very significant relationship he was in for a lot of people. They were dating in 2018, were set to get engaged, and then the engagement was called off. And I think that set off a lot of depression and drug use for him at the time, right? She has 2 songs. One is called Pete Davidson, dedicated to Pete, and one is called Thank You Next, where she references Pete Davidson. And originally it was thought that it's like this callous sort of like, what do you want to call it, exposing Pete in the media and using his name, a light version of dragging him through the mud. In fact, it doesn't appear to be the case. Both are like genuinely, thank you. Yeah. And I grew because of you and this kind of stuff. But also because he was going through some bad times, so it didn't look good. Kate Beckinsale. Yes, that Kate Beckinsale. Not Kate Beckinsale's daughter. Kate Beckinsale herself, who's 20 years older than Pete. They also had a relationship for a little bit of time. Daughter of Andy McDowell, Margaret Qualley. He was with model Kaya Gerber. He was with Bridgerton actress Phoebe Dynevor. Dynevor? Dynevor?
It's one of those two. Yeah.
It's one of those. And then probably as significant as Ariana Grande, because of the drama around it, was his time dating Kim Kardashian. They broke up in 2022, but that was pretty big. It also, speaking of things setting people off, that set off Kanye West, threatened. Anyway, we'll do an episode on that, perhaps. Yeah, that was a lot of drama and I probably a quote-unquote exciting time for Kim Kardashian. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Pete Davidson's a lucky guy. I think he basically looks like the illegitimate child of Steve Buscemi. And I don't think Steve Buscemi was dating all these, models and actresses and all, so I don't know. He's doing something right, I guess, this guy.
He has good teeth, though. He's got good teeth.
What?
He's got good teeth, I think.
Which one? Neither of them
Pete
do.
Davidson.
No, he doesn't.
Does he not?
I don't think so. I'm going to Google that right now as you keep talking.
Okay, can you, Pete Davidson teeth, can we get something up there and then share that with our listeners as well? I think everybody needs to know. Because Steve is known for his terrible teeth in particular. And I thought when I was watching the special, he had a good set of chompers up there.
Okay, you're right. Yeah, his teeth are pretty good.
You see? Well, I don't know why you turn on somebody that
They're normal human teeth, okay? There's nothing.
I don't have normal human teeth, so I regard normal teeth as very good teeth.
Yeah, neither do I. Oh yeah, Steve Buscemi. I'm just googling that now. Horrible teeth. Yeah, okay, you're right.
Yeah, please, huh?
Sorry, formal apology.
When it comes to teeth and when it comes to hair, you can count on me to know who has good teeth and good hair. I'm looking. I'm curious. I'm in wonder. Chase Suey Wonders is somebody he was dating in 2023. He was in a car crash with her. That ended something, again, he references in his special.
Yeah, he drove into a house. Okay.
He drove into a house. Nobody injured. But yeah, he had to agree to 50 hours of community service and attend traffic school and that kind of stuff. And now he is with Madeline Klein. And Madeline Klein is an actress and model and age.
You might remember her from Glass Onion. She played, you'll remember who she is. She's very attractive, and she was the kind of ingenue in that one. You'll if you've seen it, yeah, exactly. You'll remember who that is. So, well, okay. Well, I mean, exciting stuff from that point of view. As you mentioned, he talks about some of these things, his car crash, his relationships, obviously his mother, 9/11, all these things in his new stand-up special. When you read that New York Times article I was telling you about from 10 years ago, they talk about his comedy style. It's quite a praising, positive article about him, saying that Pete Davidson has this kind of shoulder-shrugging, post-trauma, post-trigger warning comedy. That's his calling card. And Pete Davidson, who in the article they always refer to as Mr. Davidson, which I guess is how a reporter would do it, but it's just so funny. They says this is his anti-method of comedy. He's like, there's nothing I won't joke about, and that's because of what happened to me. That's the worst thing that could ever happen to somebody. So now it's like, who cares, man? And I would venture to say that's not just his philosophy in comedy. It's probably his philosophy in life as well. This is pure speculation on my part. But again, lots of women, famous, successful, attractive women have been attracted to him. And maybe it's because he's like, well, whatever. Like, you will probably have a lot of confidence and not a lot of fear in your life when the absolute worst thing that could happen to you has already happened when you were a kid. So,
Sure, that's on his end, and on the end of some women, not all, but some women do love a broken wing. Let me fix this guy. Let me straighten his back
just
out.
Like Mr.
Shrug his shoulders
said.
As much.
Yeah, exactly.
What did Mr. say?
Take these broken wings. Learn to fly again. Learn to live so free.
Fly again. Fly.
Okay, so what do you think about? What do you think about his comedy style? And this recent special on Netflix from a few months ago is called Turbo Fonzerelli. That's a good name for a comedy special. I like.
He never references why it's called.
No, I know, which I love even more. That's even better. So what do you think? Yeah, what do you think of his comedy style in general and about this special in particular?
This is a weird thing I'm going to say. I didn't laugh a ton. I found it amusing. I found it on brand for Pete Davidson, but I liked it. I liked it in the way that he's sort of matured as a comedian, as a performer, and he's taken that exact post-trauma, post-trigger warning thing that you just mentioned from the New York Times. He's taken that to an elevated level. And I also have probably matured as somebody who watches comedy, or, my thoughts have changed. Who I liked 10 years ago when Pete Davidson came out was people who were on stage caring and looking like they cared. And when I see 20-year-old Pete Davidson doing comedy, I was like, this guy doesn't look like he wants to be on stage. He looks like, I don't know, somebody just shoved me out here and now I'm here. So I guess I'll just talk to you. I did not fully appreciate in any way that was his style or his calling card. And the people who have vouched for him are people who've sat with him and gotten to know who he is as well. So I think I was missing all that context. I just saw a guy who's like, let's say you're at the pinnacle of a springboard to a real insane career when you're on Saturday Night Live, right? Either it is your career in the case of certain people, or it's like in the Will Ferrells of the world, it's the beginning and then the world's your oyster. And to see a guy at age 20 not looking like he's appreciating that, I think that got into my mind and that affected how I saw his comedy as well. At this point, again, it's not a laugh a minute. Some of it is, I think of like my kids watching it, and that's unfortunate. I wish I didn't think about them, but I'm like, oh, well, I hope my son doesn't watch this. This is deeply inappropriate for a kid. I don't like to think about things like that. I would just rather enjoy the comedy. But yeah, overall I enjoyed it. Not a lot of laughs, and yet enjoyable to see Pete Davidson really leaning into who he is and why he is who he is, and mentioning it out loud, saying like, this is why I don't care about what I say about these things.
Yeah, I would say the exact same thing. That was my impression of it. Did I regret watching it? Absolutely not. I do find it very interesting, his life, how he's dealt with certain things, interesting things that happened to him. I think he is a storytelling comedian along the lines of a Chappelle, right? Like he goes through these stories. Some of them I thought were really funny. It's about how he had a crush on Leonardo DiCaprio when he was a kid, and his mom reacted to that. That's pretty good stuff. Like that's pretty solid. The story about a stalker is interesting. He did have a stalker, and he talks about that. He kind of goes to a bit more into like some bathroom humor jokes that I wasn't. The story of the stalker is more interesting. So I'd actually like to hear him just tell serious stories with some comedy, as opposed to like try to be a laugh a minute. That's what I prefer to him. And I think again, I'm assuming, but I think this is what Apatow, Hader, Lorne Michaels see in him. And that I think is the interesting thing about him to me.
I do have to mention this, and this was early in his career, and I think this is when I got a glimpse of the power of Pete Davidson on stage. It was the roast of Justin Bieber, and it was 2015 or 2016. And he tells, knowing what everybody knows about his father, he says to Snoop Dogg and Kevin Hart was hosting it. Snoop Dogg was on the roast panel. He talks about the movie Soul Plane, and he says, that film was the worst experience of my life involving a plane, which is, I mean, what a joke.
Yeah.
What a joke. It's really like, and they gave him full respect for that as well. So, I mean, if you don't like comedy like that, then this is not your guy. And I end by talking about that joke because that is the line. If that'll help you know if Pete Davidson's your guy or not. And if you find that funny, dive into his latest special and the special before it from a few years ago as well, or SMD from 5 years ago now. And if that's not your type of joke, you don't need Pete Davidson in your life.
So as I mentioned in the opening, Pete Davidson suffers from Crohn's disease. He was diagnosed at around 17, 18 years old, and he has used medical marijuana for it, as you talked about. Not a ton of evidence for it, but certainly for some of the pain related that related to the disease that might help. And we could talk about the therapy he does get. I kind of researched that and found out which therapy he's on. But why don't we get talking about Crohn's disease? Ellie, does that sound good?
Yeah, sure. And I would love to know about if there's any proof about medical marijuana. Are there studies that are being done where it's recommended in any way for people with Crohn's or not? But just so we get down to, like, was he self-diagnosing?
Not that I'm aware of. There could be some down the pipeline, but not that I'm aware of. To answer that question right off the top.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Crohn's disease. What is it? How is it much more than the very simplistic definition that Pete Davidson leaves us with in his special? Okay, let's start by, why don't you tell us who Chron is? Why is he famous for this disease? Why is his name shoehorned?
Yeah, so I used to think when I was in medical school that it was Crohn's disease, Crone, like an old crone, like it only happened in old women, which is stupid because that's not what happens. And so really ignorant. So it's Chron. It was named originally after this guy, Burl Bernard Chron, in around 1932 or so. But he did research with these other two guys, Leon Ginsberg and Gordon D. Oppenheimer. Okay, and
Oppenheimer?
Different Oppenheimer. And they described what Crohn's disease is now, which is this inflammation of the bowels, and the intestine. And we'll talk about the extent that it can occur in. So, but why it's called Crohn's disease, no one actually knows, because the other guys, Ginsberg and Oppenheimer, were just as involved, or maybe even more involved, in the discovery. But somehow they get left off. So a bit controversial in terms of the naming of it. So that's a little medical history for you.
Poor old Ginsberg and Oppenheimer. Well, they got their due respect today on our podcast. And with that out of the way, why don't you tell us exactly what Crohn's disease is?
Or Ginsberg-Oppenheimer disease, as I like to call it. Now I won't.
Oh,
it's too long. So this is a chronic, so long-standing set of symptoms where you get inflammation of the digestive tract. And it can occur anywhere, as they say, from the mouth to the anus. This is a common phrasing that we use in medicine when we talk about Crohn's disease, whereas the ulcerative colitis, which we talked about a few episodes ago, that's only in the colon, right? So this can be anywhere. So, and patients will have episodic symptoms. So they will have periods of relapse where they're doing very badly, lots of symptoms, and then periods of remission. And then they can go up and down like this.
We'll get back to something Pete Davidson says about his sort of relapses and his periods of remission and all that. But what are the symptoms then? And I guess there are many, right? If it's mouth to anus, that's a lot of things in between that can suffer from inflammation. So what are the symptoms of this?
Yeah, so it can have general manifestations. So these would be like feeling unwell, having a low-grade fever, and then prolonged bouts of diarrhea with abdominal pain, weight loss.
Well, it almost sounds like an allergic reaction to something, like if you had like a mild food poisoning or something when you say it that way.
It could be acute like that, acute meaning sudden and onset, but it's more kind of grumbling along you, and you have this over time, and then you're fatigued, and you lose weight. Some patients will have a crampy or steady pain around their belly button or in their right side of their abdomen, right lower side. Of course, that's where your appendix is too. So maybe people think you have appendicitis, but then it's kind of going on a long time. The diarrhea can be bloody, but often it's not. It just depends on where it's occurring, right? If the inflammation is occurring closer to your colon and your rectum, then you might have more bloody stool. And that might even look like ulcerative colitis because it's kind of in the colon, right? But if it's occurring in other areas, you might not get that. And sometimes it can be very hard to diagnose because kids, for example, just may look like they're not growing well, and then they're undernourished, they're underweight, and people wonder what's going on. I remember somebody who I went to med school with, she told me she had inflammatory bowel disease. She was losing weight, and they thought she had anorexia. And people are kind of, want to send her to a psychiatrist? She's like, no, I don't. And then she was eventually diagnosed. So sometimes it can be a bit subtle, especially if it's occurring in these higher up areas of the bowel or small intestine. And so there are more serious consequences you can get with the inflammation. You can get obstruction because things become so inflamed that you get an obstruction of your bowels. Obviously, that would be really bad. And you can get things called fistula. I'm saying fistulas, but that's not actually the plural, is fistulae, but whatever. If you want to be the grammar
look at you
police.
taking liberties in the industry.
Do you know what a fistula is, Ollie?
I don't even want you to pressure me to come up with a guess because it's going to be super.
So these are connections, abnormal connections between two kind of either cavities or organs. So basically, you can get what's called a fistula, say, between your bowels and another organ. So you can get like an enterovesical fistula. That's a connection between your bladder and your intestine. So you can imagine if your stool or contents of your intestines are going into your bladder, you're going to get urinary tract infections and potentially very sick. There's even something called pneumaturia where you have air. You're supposed to be peeing, but it's like air coming out, and it's quite serious, obviously, if that happens. You can have an enterovaginal fistula. So that goes in women into their vagina. And then you have feculent feces type discharge from the vagina.
Oh my God.
You have an enterocutaneous fistula. So it goes out through your skin. And then you would have like what they say feculent, so feces soiling of your skin. Could be around your anus, could be anywhere though. Or you could just have connections within your bowel, and then you could get like a perforation in your bowel. You could get abscesses in your abdomen. It's quite concerning. You could get what's called a frank perforation, which is almost like a rupture of your bowel. That would be you'd be very, very sick from that. So anyway, yeah, it can be pretty serious.
Is today a special day on Doctor versus Comedian where we know what causes a disease?
It is not a special day because we don't really know what causes it, but it's believed to be this imbalance between your anti-inflammatory mediators, so the kind of the chemicals in your body, and pro-inflammatory. So this balance, and something's off because you're getting this uncontrolled inflammation. We know that there's a genetic susceptibility and maybe environmental triggers as well. So just for some of the environmental triggers, and these are kind of been described, they're not 100%, but they say smoking has been shown to double the risk of Crohn's disease, but ulcerative colitis is actually lower in patients who smoke, right? They think a diet that may be high in fatty foods could increase the risk of Crohn's disease. They used to think the measles vaccine, if you look at stuff from many, many decades ago, they thought the measles vaccine was related. It's not. Those have been unfounded. And we talked before about if you've had your appendix out, that's protective in ulcerative colitis, but having your appendix out, whether it's out or not, does not seem to affect Crohn's disease. So again, we're seeing some similarities and differences between those two disorders.
Which is interesting. It makes it interesting that I don't know why I'm lumping myself in, but the industry has lumped it together as Crohn's and colitis.
Yeah.
Whereas we keep noticing these things that are quite different about the two of them.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. In medicine, we have this term, are you a lumper or a splitter? Right? Do you group things together under the term inflammatory bowel disease, or should you separate them out? Obviously, you want to lump them together. For example, like I think as Ali has mentioned to me offline, there's the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. They kind of lump them together because, they want to try and raise research for both of these, but they're not the same. And a gastroenterologist will certainly talk to people about the differences between the two. And one of them, which we don't have to get into surgery too much, but when we get to treatment, surgery may be a bit less common in Crohn's disease and would only be used in certain cases as opposed to ulcerative colitis. But, so it's important to know the differences because the treatment might be different, right?
I know that I'm a splitter, but after a few drinks, lumping for sure. How common is it?
So in adults, it's about 200 cases per 100,000 people. Kids, it's a bit less common, but it can affect kids for sure. We'll talk about that in a second maybe, but 43 per 100,000.
You're not mentioning North America or worldwide. You just said 100,000 persons.
Mm-hmm.
Where are we talking about?
Yeah, it's actually more common in Europe and North America. And there is, similar to some other diseases we've talked about or will talk about in a few weeks, there's a north to south gradient. So it's more common in temperate climates, so Western Europe, North America. And as new regions assume more Western cultural practices, diet and otherwise, then you see an increased prevalence of both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And the most interesting part is the ulcerative colitis incidence increases a decade before you get the increase in Crohn's disease.
No, Asif, that is not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is that you just said when people adopt Western practices, including diet, these things go up, and yet we don't study Western diet in Western medicine. That's the most interesting thing.
Okay. Let's all relax.
Suck on that, West. Yeah, okay.
We're going to talk about kids. So there's actually what we call a bimodal distribution in terms of when it occurs. So it either occurs when you're young, so between the ages 15 to 30, or later on between 60 and 70, which is depressing because I think I thought we were out of the woods, but we're not. So just wait a little bit. Most cases really do occur below age 30, though, and 20 to 30% of patients are diagnosed before age 20. So it really is a pediatric disease as well.
You see kids in your practice who come in and you diagnose Crohn's, or you send them to somebody else who will?
So usually what would happen is not me because I'm a subspecialist, but pediatrician, would see them. A lot of these concerns, the abdominal pain that's kind of long-standing, diarrhea, bloody diarrhea, weight loss. There's a term we use in pediatrics called failure to thrive. It's a weird terminology. I don't know why we use it, but it's a failure to gain weight and height appropriately. That would you probably refer to a gastroenterologist, and then they do investigations to see if this is what you might have.
Are there pediatric gastroenterologists or just a gastro?
Oh, yeah, there's lots. Yeah, lots of there. I work with lots of them, and they're extremely busy, lots of cases, lots of patients to see.
You said the word investigations there, which I've never heard you say.
Come on.
Law and order, Crohn's disease type of vibes. What does that mean? How do they test for it?
There's lots of tests they do. I mean, your doctor will probably do some blood tests. Obviously, they want to see if you have like bloody diarrhea. Is that dropping your hemoglobin? Do you have like low blood counts in your body? And there's other tests you can do. We talked on the ulcerative colitis episode about there's some blood tests you can do. One is called an ASCA and one's called a p-ANCA. And depending on which one is positive, which one is negative, you can say you're more likely to have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. But in the end, you need to usually do a scope. You can do imaging, you can do an MRI, CT scans, ultrasounds, but in the end, you need to have a scope. And this is a bit different because ulcerative colitis, you'd have a colonoscopy, right? Because that's where the symptoms are from. But you might need to do what's called a colonoscopy, which is a lower scope, but you may need to do an upper endoscopy, right? Starting in the mouth and going down, because of course, Crohn's disease can occur anywhere in your GI tract. And then they'll often biopsy that, look at that under a microscope, and based on what they see, they could be able to make a diagnosis of Crohn's disease based on that.
Okay, let's talk about the treatment. Two things that I know about the treatment. One is I have a friend who's a comedian who has Crohn's disease, and he goes, I think it's every 2 months for some kind of infusion.
Yeah.
And then I also wanted to touch on this thing that Pete Davidson said, where he was saying that I've got like 90% of my Crohn's disease under control because I'm doing very well, right? He suggested that because of his own financial resources, he's able to keep it under control. So I wanted to just tap into those two things as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting point. I didn't quite get that. I didn't catch that in his special, but that's a very interesting point. And again, he lives in the US, right? So the treatment of Crohn's disease has really changed a lot, especially since I was in medical school. It's really changed. So there is, remember I said that there's a balance between pro-inflammation and anti-inflammation in your body?
I'm going to say, yes, I do remember that. I do.
So one of the inflammatory mediators is something called TNF, or tumor necrosis factor, okay? It doesn't really have to do with tumors in this case. So you can use what are called biologic agents, which are anti-TNF, anti-tumor necrosis factor. And you give these to people.
What is a biological agent? What does that mean?
They are often injectables, less commonly, and these are what we call disease-modifying agents. So they will often be, but not always, what we call monoclonal antibodies. Again, not always, but basically you can develop antibodies or other means to, let's just say, attack this tumor necrosis factor and neutralize it. Okay, so now you're neutralizing this pro-inflammatory mediator because the tumor necrosis factor is in your body. We all have it in our body, but it's going out of control in lots of diseases and specifically in Crohn's disease. So you want to try and neutralize this, right? And so I'm simplifying this immensely, but this is the way I understand it. And so there's lots of ones. Infliximab is probably the most commonly used one. There's a whole bunch of other ones. I'm not going to get into all of them.
And these are all injected?
Yeah, they're usually given as an IV infusion, but not all of them. Some of them can be given as an injection. So these have really changed the disease. So you have to go to an infusion center or get an injection every so often. And infliximab is also called Remicade, and that's what Pete Davidson's on. And it's very common medicine for people to be on. Your friend is probably on it as well. And so there's two approaches to treatment. Again, I'm not a pediatric or adult gastroenterologist. I'm not an expert on this, but from my understanding, there's two approaches. So either it's a step up or a top down approach, right? A step up would mean people maybe with mild disease, you start for a less toxic treatment first. So they can give what's called 5-ASA, which is an anti-inflammatory medicine. They can give antibiotics. They can give what's called nutritional therapy. And if you do that, you can maybe keep the disease down. You can also give more milder immune modulators. Some of them had to have side effects like corticosteroids. There's also things like methotrexate, which you might have heard about. At least you can give those things. But then if you have really moderate or severe disease, you might do a top-down approach where you might start with these biologic agents. So like the Remicade, which is the infliximab. You might start with that to try and get things nice and under control. Why wouldn't you start with that with everybody? Because these biologic agents do have side effects because they are suppressing your immune system, so they can predispose you to things like infection. And so there has to be a balance between these, the risks and the benefits. And that's something that obviously that's why you need to see a specialist like a gastroenterologist, and they'll manage it. I must admit, the people I know thankfully, with Crohn's disease. So you asked if I see these patients. I do. There's very few neurologic side effects of Crohn's disease. I just see them because by coincidence, they happen to have Crohn's disease usually and something else. That's usually the way it is. And it's not uncommon, as we talked about. So some patients will have two things, unfortunately, a neurologic issue and the Crohn's disease. So I'll see them. I would say the majority of patients I see, at least, seem to be doing quite well. They're quite happy on the therapy. As Pete Davidson says, majority of their symptoms are controlled. My friends who have Crohn's disease, pretty well controlled. I think like your friend as well. Like you are able to do it. Sometimes you have to escalate though to these treatments.
Okay, so just to put a final pin in this, if somebody suspects that they may have Crohn's disease or colitis, your first course of action is blood test. Is that right? You see a doctor?
You go see your doctor. Yeah, they will. I think the real thing, the reason to do blood tests is to rule out something else. Like, do you, as you said, do you have an infection? Do you have food poisoning? And some food poisonings, which we talked about on previous episodes, we have a episode in the archives on food poisoning as well. There are some things like Giardia. Giardia is this infectious disease you can get. We often get it from like swimming in lake water and stuff like that. And that can cause like a chronic kind of diarrhea. So it's not like the food poisoning that we think about where you're vomiting and you're sick for like 24 to 72 hours. This could be like going on for weeks and weeks and you only figure it out after a while. So you definitely want to see your doctor. They'll assess you. They'll talk about, is there evidence of an infection or could you actually have symptoms that could be related to inflammatory bowel disease? And if they are suspicious of it, they may do some blood work, but they'll probably refer you to a gastroenterologist for further assessment. And then when they see you, if they're really suspicious, they were, in most cases, do a scope and see what they see. That's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought about our discussion about Pete Davidson. What did you think? Did you see his new special? What did you think of that? Did you see King of Staten Island or his show Bupkis? What did you think of those? Let us know if there's any other comedians, especially if they have medical conditions. We'd be very interested to talk about them. And what did you guys think about our discussion about Crohn's disease, how it paired with ulcerative colitis? Reach out to us. drvcomedian@gmail.com, drvcomedian at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We are everywhere. Reach out to us. Like we said, suggestions for other podcast topics. We'd love to hear what you guys think. We definitely want to be providing what you guys want to hear, not just what interests Ollie and I. And also, we always love those 5-star reviews, right, Ollie?
We do. They actually help us a ton. They put us sort of higher up on the map and get us this show exposed to more people. So if it's no skin off your back, and typically it wouldn't be to just give us a positive review and full stars, we would definitely appreciate that.
Ali, anything you got going on in May?
I got enough things going on. Nothing's going on.
It sounds like you're saying nothing, but...
Nuff, N-U-F-F.
Yeah,
I got enough things going on. I am going to be at the Winnipeg Comedy Festival.
Oh.
If you're in Winnipeg, don't hesitate to reach out. You're going to be maybe obsessed with your Winnipeg Jets, who are doing well and then not well and then well and then not well, but I will be there. And then hosting something called Forest of Reading in Toronto, keeping my roots in the literature world, and a number of other things as I start to travel a little bit across the country. Standupali.com is the website.
We'll hear about your Canadian Screen Awards. That's what it's called, right? Like your awards and multiple awards.
Yeah, you will hear at the end of May about how I lost in 2 different categories. An honor to be nominated is what I'm saying, and I mean it.
We won't see tears in your eyes. Like, you got to do something funny if they show your face when they do it. I don't know. Will it be on on the telecast because they're both considered guest starring roles? Is that right? Or is it
I don't know if it will be. I don't believe that'll be.
Well, let's hope it will be. You know, else I hope that you remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.